And again, this session is going to be VCSBT 10, Administrative Training, Managing Employees. And just to recap once more, we'll be covering how to enter a new employee, the couple of screens we have to use to do that. We'll also be covering how to promote an employee who maybe receives a new title. And then finally, how to terminate an employee who no longer works at your department. So we'll start at the beginning. We'll start with entering a new employee into the system. When you do have a new hire, the first step you're going to do is go under the Administration menu, and you're going to go to Employee Center. And we're going to start by going into Employee Profile. Okay, this is the absolute first thing we have to do for a new hire. We can't do anything else until we have created their employee profile. So we'll take a look at some of the fields on this screen and talk about what they do and which ones are mandatory, which ones are recommended. So at the top, I'll hit New to get a blank screen here. And that will automatically mark that the employee is active. Okay. We have a couple of checkboxes up here. Most of these are informational. The main ones that might have an effect on what you're doing is exempt employee. That would mean it's an employee who is not eligible to be paid for overtime. This would allow you to enter overtime for that employee, but it would just never be sent to payroll. It would only be recorded for your own records in the system. Part-time employee, if the employee is part-time, there are certain times where we can filter certain information by whether or not the employee is a part-timer. And civilian as well. There may be times where you need to filter payroll information based on whether someone is a civilian or not. So those are probably the three most important of those checkboxes at the top there, aside from employee is active, which would be automatically marked. Moving down to our fields, the first thing we have here, of course, is first name and last name, which are required fields, and middle initial, which is an optional field. Date of birth, driver's license, and race or ethnicity are optional fields. They're informational. They don't necessarily drive anything in our system or cause anything to happen, we'll say. There, I believe, is a report or two that can pull some of that information in if you ever wanted to report on it, but other than that, it is just informational. The employee's sex or gender, this is optional as well. And it is mostly informational, with the exception of there are some rules in the replacement policy that can be set up by the employee's sex or gender. Most often I see those used at correctional facilities where maybe we need to offer the overtime only to female corrections officers or male corrections officers, depending on our staffing needs. Okay, so out of all the information up here in this top personal details section, first name and last name are the only required items. Moving down to the bottom section here, we have a space for code. Every employee must have a unique employee ID, and that would be entered into this code. This field is alphanumeric, and it can be up to 15 characters. Now, most departments, if you're already using the system, there's already a probably predetermined item that's used for this. Some departments use badge number, which is fine as long as your badge numbers don't repeat or get reused. A lot of departments will use maybe a payroll ID or an HR ID or town or city ID number. Again, just as long as it's unique and does not ever repeat, that is certainly fine. After code, we have group. This dropdown will allow you to select from the groups that have been set up for your department. So I can choose what group does this person belong to. And below that, I can select their title as well. So what title does this employee carry? I can choose from the dropdown. Those three items, of course, are required, which is why they're highlighted in red. The other items here are not required. Badge number, if you want to place that there, that's fine. That is, again, mostly informational, although that can be pulled into certain reports if you needed to include the badge number. I'm going to skip down here to hire date and accrual date. Hire date is an informational field. If you want to enter what day that person was hired, that's great. You certainly can do that. Accrual date is probably a little bit more important because that is what we use to determine what step an employee is at for their time off accruals. So if your department has your time accruals set up in our system to deposit time into people's banks every so often based on years of service, this accrual date is what the system is using to figure out what step that employee is at. Now, in a lot of cases, the hire date and the accrual date might be the exact same thing, and that's fine. You can certainly set those to be the same date. But we have had some places who needed to have it separate, either because maybe an employee worked for my town for a couple of years before they started with the police department, and maybe we allow them to keep those years of service and include them in their placement on the accrual steps. So in that case, maybe their hire department with the police department is today, their hire date with the police department is today, and maybe their accrual date is a couple of years ago. I've also seen some departments where they might take into consideration military service that might affect someone's accrual date. So that's why we have them separated. If any of those apply to you, that's great. You can set them up individually. But if those don't apply to you, then you can certainly set those dates as the exact same thing. Okay. And then down here, seniority is a required field. Seniority would be a number that kind of indicates where that person falls in a list of other employees. That field comes pre-populated with a 0 in it, so you could still save it without entering their actual seniority number. In case you didn't know it at this point in time, we don't want you to enter all that information and then have to turn back and lose what you entered. So you can save it with that 0 in there and come back and enter it later if you like. The other items on this tab are informational. Date in date and step or promotion. If I want to mark, when an employee got a certain reached a certain step or promotion, and then I can also up here identify what that step or level that they're at is. Promotion date, appointment date. These are just fields that you can use to record information. They're strictly informational. They don't correlate or they don't power anything in our system. They're not needed for any of the functions They're just a place to store that information if you'd like to keep it all in one spot there. So that's our general information. Under contact information, we have a spot here to enter contact information for that employee. The most important item here is going to be the employee's email address. Our system sends out emails for a number of reasons. The most common are if someone requests time off or overtime, that can generate an email to their supervisor. If that time off or overtime is approved or denied, that will send an email back to the employee letting them know. Also notifies employees of movement on their schedule and things along those lines. So email address is probably the most important item on this page. The second most important items are probably either your phone numbers and or your text message address. And that really just depends on what functions in the system your department's using. If you're using replacement policy to generate a call list and you're calling employees to offer them overtime, then obviously it's important to have their phone numbers in there so that way when their name comes up, their phone numbers show with it. So in that scenario, you want to make sure you have at least one phone number entered for the employee. And as far as text message address goes, if your department is reaching out to employees via text message, either to notify them of things going on in the department or maybe overtime that's available or that's been posted, then you want to make sure that the employee has a text message address in there. And just a reminder that a text message address is not just the employee's cell phone number, but it's their cell phone number and then the @ symbol, and then something based on their carrier. And we usually recommend using the MMS address instead of the text address, just because that allows for more characters before your message gets cut off. So an example would be like 555, 555, 5555 @ and for AT&T it's mms.att.net, I believe. Okay, so 10-digit number right here, and then and then something based on whoever your carrier is. Okay, needs to be formatted that way. Just putting the employee's cell phone number will not work, will not cut it. The other information here is really just informational. I can enter the employee's address, and I can enter their emergency contact as well if I like, if I have that information. Now, we also have a screen on the web portal that could allow an employee to fill out their own contact information. So some departments, instead of filling it out for them, are just having the employee go in to the web and enter their information themselves. So if your department is doing that, then maybe you don't have to enter this information. You can just let the employee enter it for themselves. Although I may still recommend at least putting in their department email address to get them started. Okay. Our other tabs here, notes, this is just a free entry field where I could go in and add a new note and type some information and then save that note. Any information you might want to keep in the employee profile, that can be used for. Interface IDs are rarely used anymore. You can just really leave that tab alone. Application tab, we'll come back and talk about that later. ID card not really being used anymore, you can leave that alone. Custom fields, unless your department has some custom fields set up, this would just be blank, you don't have to worry about that. And then finally, PARS kiosk. If your department is using kiosks or the PARS dialer, then you may need to enter a PIN number for that employee. Okay, but our main items that all departments will need will be found under the General tab and the Contact Information tab. Once you've filled those items out, you can save that employee profile up at the top. Okay, does anybody have any questions about creating an employee profile for a new employee, how to do it or what information gets entered there? Okay. All right, so we'll move on to the next screen that we would use for a new employee. We're going to close out of here. And after we've created that employee's ID, we can then go into Pay Info and update that employee's pay information. So I would find my employee in my list here. And I would click on their name. And then the main items, the most important items that we would look for here would be number one, work group. Okay, I can choose from the drop-down one of the work groups that has been entered into my system. Now, work group is how we group people together. It's usually based on either what union I'm a part of or what contract I fall under or what CBA I belong to. This work group is what drives or what defines what rules are run for this employee. So things like accruals, right? We might have 5 different sets of rules for different work groups. Well, the work group a person belongs to defines which set of rules the system uses to apply time to their bank. Holiday rules also use work group. So if we have rules set up for the holidays to either put some people on a day off or give some people overtime who maybe work the holidays, those rules are based on our work group, as well as some payroll rules. Some rules that are run at payroll, things like overtime recalculation and processing, shift differential, and auto time sellback. Those are all based on the work group that I belong to. So very important to make sure we select the work group for that employee so that way the right rules start applying to them. Working our way down here, omit employee from timesheet. If this employee is someone that we do not want to create timesheets for and we don't want to include in payroll, then you can mark that checkbox so the system knows not to expect a timesheet from that person. Continuing down, Payroll ID. This is a place where you can place that employee's payroll ID, and that may come in handy again when we're reporting or exporting to payroll. We may need to pull that field, that number, into our report or our export. Clock swipe number. Only comes into play if your department is having employees punch in and punch out. If you are, each employee needs a unique clock swipe number. A lot of departments will just use the payroll ID number or maybe like an HR ID number to put in that field so that way each employee gets a unique clock swipe number. And then department is a two-part field. The second part will show up on an employee's timesheet and can also be used in some screens to filter your employees by payroll department. So if you want to separate employees out by different departments, you can put that there. It's an alphanumeric field, so whether you do a department number or a description, that's fine too. Standard hours scheduled per pay period. For departments that are reporting a flat or standard hours each pay period for employees, not looking at actual hours worked, but just reporting a flat 80 or a flat 70 hours for an employee, you can put the standard hours in there, and that will be able to be pulled into a report or an export. The next most important thing would be down here under Lunchtimes, minutes of unpaid lunch. If this employee has an unpaid lunch factored into their schedule, we want to make sure we put that there. So in other words, if I'm scheduled 8 to 4:30, 8.5 hours, but I have a half an hour of unpaid lunch, so I'm only paid for 8 hours, you want to make sure that you put 30 minutes in the unpaid lunch field. And this is important not just for reporting hours. Maybe if we need to report the employee's hours to payroll, we want to make sure we don't include the unpaid lunch. But it's also important for time off. If I take the whole day off, we want to charge 8 hours from my bank, not 8.5. Okay, so minutes of unpaid lunch is important for any employees that it applies to. Minutes of paid lunch and default lunchtime, those are just optional informational fields. They don't do anything. They're just a place to store that information if you like. Down here where we have a spot for payroll codes, different departments may use these fields for payroll exports or payroll reporting. It really depends on your department's payroll needs. My advice would be to check another employee, an existing employee's pay info, and see what they have in these fields, and then make sure that you put similar information for the new employee. Again, that will vary department by department. We also have a tab up here for pay rates if you would like to enter the employee's pay rate. Very rarely does this ever have anything to do with payroll. 99% of the time when we deal with payroll, we just send over hours and codes, and payroll deals with the pay amounts because they're the official keeper of pay rates. But if you want to put the information in here, in our system, it will allow you to run certain valuation reports on things like overtime. So I could see how much did overtime cost me this year or this month, something along those lines. Obviously, it depends on the accuracy of those reports depends on keeping up with this information. So if you're going to enter the pay rates, then they're going to need to be updated whenever a change happens. Okay. So if I like, I can just enter an amount in the annual salary, and it will fill the rest of these fields out for me. But really the main things that we're using for overtime reporting are these three fields right here: straight overtime, time and a half overtime, and double time overtime. Okay. So even if we didn't fill this out, we could just come in here and enter the amount. Okay, if you don't want to bother with these other items here, you can just manually enter the straight, time and a half, and double time rates. And if you are entering the pay rates, you can also take this and add it to the salary history, which is right here. So this will allow you to have like a running list of an employee's salary and when they bumped up to different amounts, if you want to keep that information in there as well. Okay, so most important items are on the initial payroll tab. You want to pay attention to work group, payroll ID, minutes of unpaid lunch, and then standard hours per pay period and payroll codes if you're using those for your department. Everything else is kind of optional, and when I'm done, I can hit save up at the top to save that employee's pay information. Okay, does anybody have any questions about entering the employee's pay info? What goes in there? Okay. Moving on to our next step then, we want to create a user ID for our new employee so that way they can begin logging into the system. So it is possible for me to go in under Administration and Employee Center and go into the user profile and manually enter all this information in here. But I find that it's easier, even if I'm only doing it for one or two people, to create my users using Mass Auto Create User. That again is under Administration and Employee Center and Mass Auto Create Users. Okay, so what I would do is I would go in here, I would select my employee using my employee selection button here. Find my new employee, select them, and do select and close. And then in this top section here, I'm going to identify the pattern that we're using for the user ID. So a lot of departments like to use first letter, last name. So I would do first one letter of the first name and full last name. Or I could do first two letters of the first name and full last name. Or I could do the full first name and the last initial. Again, if you are an existing customer who's just adding a new employee, you probably already have a layout that you're using for this. We have some other options over here. You can use the employee code. You can use the payroll ID. You can use the badge number. You can insert characters like periods or underscores or dashes. So, I could even do something such as full last name and then put the badge number after the last name, or put the badge number before the last name. You can even do something like that. I'm going to use a basic example of first initial last name for our example here. And then down here, where it says user profile, we're going to enter the information that will complete this employee's user profile. Okay, so security level, this is old security. We're going to make that just user. Security profile, this is the new security that's running everything on the web and everything in Schedule app. So I can choose from my options here. Presumably, if I'm adding a new employee, it's going to be some type of basic user security, because they're probably brand new. And then web dashboard. Whenever they go to the daily schedule on the web, what is their default view that they see? What is their default web dashboard? So I could say default to the patrol web dashboard. And then default tile profile. If they go into the desktop application, what is the default tile profile that we see up here that they would load up first? So maybe that's patrol as well. Number of past days to allow update. How far back can this employee go to enter a time off or an overtime entry? And again, as an existing client who is adding a new employee to their system, you probably already have something set up for this. So maybe you're giving your users, 3 days to go back and enter items, or 5 days or 7 days. If you don't know what your department has this set as, you may want to check a user profile for an existing user and see right here, number of past days to allow update. Okay. If your employee's name was highlighted in green, that would mean that that employee already has a username. So maybe somebody already created it, or you created it and just forgot that you already created it for that employee. So that may be an indication that you don't need to bother running this again because they already have a username. Otherwise, when I have everything set the way I like it, I come up to the top here and I hit Apply Format. And that's going to take the employee name and figure out first letter of first name, full last name, and come up with this right here. If I need, we already have somebody who's using D. Wallace, I could maybe make this D. Wallace 2. Or maybe I want to add the second letter of the first name to be D.A. Wallace. Otherwise, when I'm satisfied with the employee's usernames, I would just come up to the top here and click Save. Okay, if everything goes well, it'll say successfully created one user profile. And this person's name is now highlighted in green because that employee now has a username. It is possible to have an employee be highlighted a different color if their username did not go through. Okay, if it was highlighted in red, it would mean that that username already exists. So again, maybe you didn't realize it, but we already have a D. Wallace username. Somebody else is using that. So if it was highlighted in red, you would know it's already in use, and you might want to make an adjustment and re-save it. If you had two people highlighted in orange, that would mean that you have duplicate usernames in this screen right here. So most times you would probably notice this if you're adding new employees, because you're probably only adding a few at a time. But if you had hired John Smith and Joan Smith, and they were both in the list here, and you tried to create usernames, it would do J. Smith for both of them, and it would highlight them in orange saying we have to change one of these because there's a conflict here. And finally, the yellow highlight would be an invalid username. So maybe somebody had a really long last name that caused us to go beyond 15 characters. Or maybe it had a symbol in it that we couldn't use. I think the only one that causes a problem is an apostrophe. So if you had somebody whose last name was O'Sullivan, it would create the username, with O apostrophe S-U-L-L. You might have to go in here and remove that apostrophe so that way it didn't show as an invalid username, and then resave it. Okay, but otherwise, if everything went right and we created usernames for all of the employees that we had in there, then we're done. We can close out of here. We've successfully created usernames for those employees. You can let them know what their username is so they can start signing in. If you create a username or a user profile using this mass auto create users, then the employee's default password is going to be first initial, first 8 characters of their last name. So if their last name was less than 8 characters, it would just be however many they have. If it was more than 8 characters, then it would cut off after that 8th character. Okay. Some things to keep in mind about that default password. Number one is it will respect capitals and lowercases. So, the employee's name was entered with a capital D for David and a capital W for the last name. So it would be capital D, capital W, A, L, L, A, C, E, all lowercase. The other thing to keep in mind is that any other items that are part of the employee's last name will be included in their password. So if their last name was Smith-Jones, that dash would be part of the password. If their last name was Smith and then you had a space and you had Junior in there, then their password would be, whatever the first initial is, Smith space JR. Again, respecting any capitals that are in the employee's name. Does anybody have any questions about how to create a user profile using Mass Auto Create User? Okay. All right, I don't see anything else coming through, so we'll move on to our last basic step for a brand new employee, and that's going to be assigning them to a rotation, putting them on the schedule. So we're going to close out of here, and we're going to go to our Build Schedule menu, and we're going to do Add Employees to Existing Rotations. So first thing here at the top is going to be to set a date range. Okay, I can set this for whatever I need. I can set it through the end of the year if I like. Or maybe if it's a new employee who is a new officer, maybe they are going to be bouncing around from different rotations for small periods of time. So maybe I want to say, okay, from Wednesday, September 7th through October 7th, they're going to be on one rotation, then we can assign them to a different one for the period after that. Next, I would come down here and select my employee. So I'll select that person and do select and close. Now for a brand new employee, they won't have anything here in this rotation field because they have not yet been assigned to any rotations. So this area here will be blank for a brand new employee. So then over here, I find the rotation I want to put them on. So let's say they're going to be doing a Squad B rotation for this month. I click that. And then I click anywhere on the line for this employee here. Doesn't matter where, here or here. And I hit the arrow to send that over, that rotation over to that employee. I can make some other adjustments over here, like entering their start and end time if it's different than the regular shift. Or maybe I have a job that I want to assign them. Maybe I have something that indicates that they're an officer in training or something like that. And then I'll hit apply up here. And the system will go through and build that employee's schedule for the period of time indicated up here. Okay, after I run that and let it build, then I can actually come up here and just change the dates if I need to run it a second time. So maybe I want to come up here and say, okay, starting on October 8th, and then going through November 11th, this person's going to be on Squad C. And then I can hit apply, and I can run that. So that might be what you need to do if their schedule changes a lot during the first few months of their employment. If that's not the case, if they're just going to be on a certain rotation, maybe they're a new admin person or somebody who's just a Monday through Friday, then yeah, I can just run this once, set it to say, all right, they start today, and let's say that our schedule runs through the end of the year, and they're going to be on admin Monday through Friday. And I can just apply that. Okay, so that really will depend on what type of employee they are and what schedule they're going to be working. Okay, does anybody have any questions about how to assign an employee to a rotation? Okay. All right, so those are the basics of entering a new employee. We have to create their employee profile. We have to update or enter their pay info. We have to create a user ID for them, a user profile. And then finally, we have to get them on the schedule. Now, there's a couple of items that some departments might use depending on certain features that they're using in the system. And most of these items here, they deal with either minimum staffing levels, if you're using minimum staffing, or different ways to distribute overtime. And the thing about these few items is a lot of departments will not fill these items out as soon as the employee is hired because maybe they don't count towards minimum staffing right away. Or maybe they're not allowed to work overtime right away. So these items, they may take place a few months after the employee is hired. This may be something that you want to set a reminder to do, or you just want to remember when you get the official word that this person is now a full-fledged officer and can begin working on their own. That might be the reminder to go in and set these items up. Okay, a few examples. Back under Administration and Employee Center, and back in the Employee Profile, we had a tab that we skipped past called Application. And right here, we have our validation skill sets. This is where we let the system know what, if anything, this person counts as for minimum staffing. So if I had a brand new employee here, this might be left blank because maybe I don't want them counting towards patrol, even though they're working the shift, but maybe we're not ready to have them count as helping towards our minimum quite yet. But when the time comes, I can go in here and I can put a check in the box next to that person's name. I'm sorry, I should say I can select their name and put a check in the box next to the proper skill or skills that they have, indicating that they can start counting towards those minimum staffing levels. Okay, so if your department has minimum staffing set up, you'll want to make sure you go back and mark that when the employee is ready to start being counted towards minimum staffing. Another thing right on this same tab here would be an overtime group. If your department is using open shifts for signing up for overtime, then you may need to go in here, and when that employee can start signing up for overtime, you may need to go in here and select the overtime group or groups that we want them to be part of. So in our case here, we have one for patrol. So if after a few months this person can now start signing up for patrol overtime, I go ahead and I mark it. Okay, so validation skill set for minimum staffing, overtime groups for open shifts. Once I've made those changes here, I would just click Save up at the top. The other things would be if your department is using replacement policy to assign overtime. If you are using replacement policy, then there are 2 items that you need to do for this employee to make sure they start showing up on those replacement policy lists. The first one is still here under Employee Center. It's going to be called Overtime Selection Skill Sets. And this is used if in your replacement policies you are taking your list and you're filtering it by certain overtime selection skills. If your department is using both open shifts in some instances and replacement policy in other instances, you'll need to fill both of these out, the one in the profile and the one right here as well. So I would choose my employee. I would click on their name, and then I would find the skill set over here, click on it, and hit the arrow to send it over. And that now gives that skill to that employee. So if we run an overtime replacement policy and we filter based on patrol, this person would be included. The other thing is, if you're doing replacement policy, you have to go under administration, and depending on what version you're running, this was called overtime control. In the newest version that's just being rolled out, it's called replacement policy, this subgroup here. But either way, you have to go to your employee list and make sure you add this employee to whatever overtime lists they need to be a part of. So for a lot of departments, they might just have just a general overtime list. So we would select it from our list of lists right here, and we would go to Modify Employee, and we would find that person, and we'd put a check next to their name, and hit Select and Close. And that's going to add them to this list here. Now I'm going to need to go in and give them a sort order while I'm in here. And depending on your department's replacement policy, you might be running this list based on a rotating sort order, or you might be running it based on something else, but usually it's a safe bet that I can just take this new employee and give them the last number in our sort order. So our last number is 22, so let's make this person 23. And then hit Save. So now that employee's on that list, and they're part of that overtime skill set. So if you run a set of rules that includes that list and includes people marked in the patrol skill set, their name will show up in the results. If your department uses more than one list, that's fine. You can always select an additional list and add them to that list as well if you need to. and I'll put them at the bottom of the sort order with a 27. Okay. If you don't know what any of this means, we have classes on replacement policy if you're interested in learning more about how to set up and run replacement policy or how to use open shifts. But other than that, if this is something your department uses, does anybody have any questions about how to set up these items that maybe we don't do right away? Maybe we wait till the employee's been with us for a couple of months, and then we go ahead and we add their validation skill set and their overtime group and add them to the overtime list and overtime skill set. Any questions on any of those items, how to do those things? Okay, so we're going to move on now away from new employees. We're going to move on to promoting an existing employee. Now, this is going to kind of look like a recap of adding a new employee because we have to go to a lot of the same places. But I'm just going to point out some items that you want to make sure that you remember might need adjusting for an employee who has been promoted. So first thing we'll do is we'll go under administration and back to the Employee Center. And we'll go to the employee profile. Okay. First and foremost in here, this is where I can change the employee's title. So I select the person's name. And then I select their new title from this list here. So maybe this officer is being promoted to a sergeant. I can select sergeant right here. When I select a new title, it's going to automatically check this checkbox here saying update schedule from, and then it'll have today's date. I can adjust that date if need be. You know, maybe this promotion is effective as of tomorrow, not today, or something like that. And what this means is when we save it, the system's going to go and find every time that this person is on the schedule from this date forward, and it's going to change their title from officer to sergeant. It's not going to touch their title prior to that date. So if I look back, I would still see them showing as an officer. But from this date forward, it will change their title to sergeant or whatever we choose. Now, it's possible that a new title might come with me being moved to a new group as well. Maybe I'm going to be a sergeant, but I'm no longer going to be part of Squad A. I'm now being moved to Squad D. So I can change that while I'm in here as well. And then some optional items if that results in a change in badge number for me, or if you want to record the date of this promotion, you can do that. While we're in here, we may also need to go to the Application tab and say this person now counts as an OIC or a supervisor or a sergeant, whatever it is that you've named your validation skill for your supervisors. To depending on your department, they may count as both patrol and OIC now. So maybe I leave them both marked, or maybe I have to unmark patrol if they no longer count. And again, if we're using open shifts in my department, I may need to add or change the employee's overtime group. Okay, maybe now I can start signing up for sergeant overtime. So after I make those changes, then I go ahead and I hit save. And as I mentioned before, that's going to go ahead and change their title on every schedule record we find from that date forward. So after a few seconds, you'll receive a pop-up letting you know that it changed X number of entries for that employee. Okay, so for our promoted employee, we want to go in here and change their title, possibly change their group. I forgot to mention, too, that might affect their seniority, so you might need to change that as well. And then under application, you may have to update their validation skill sets and their overtime groups. Okay, next step would be to go over to Pay Info and verify this information. Being promoted to a sergeant might mean that I am in a different work group now. You know, if our sergeants are in a separate work group from our patrol, then you might need to change my work group. Along with any other possible changes here. Maybe that means, you know, we need to use different payroll codes for payroll. So maybe I have to adjust those for the person who's now reporting as a sergeant. And that could also come with a change in my pay rate. So you may want to come in here and update my pay rates. Again, that's only if your department is including the pay rates in here. If you're not, that's fine. You can just ignore this field. Okay, once you've made those changes, we're going to save to update their pay info. Then we want to go to their user profile. We don't have to create a user profile for them because they already have one, but this promotion might come with a change in security settings. So if I find the person and I click on their name, maybe I have to change them from a basic user to a supervisor. And whether you have to update their tile profile or their web dashboard, that really might depend on if they are being promoted within the same department, or if, you know, maybe I'm being moved to a detective sergeant from patrol. Maybe you want to change my views here. That's really dependent on kind of where their promotion is going to have them working. But we definitely want to make sure we change their security profile to reflect their new position, so that way they have the permissions to do the things that they need to do. So change their security profile and then click Save to make that effective. Okay? Then my new promotion may also come with a change in my schedule. So you may have to go back under Build Schedule and back to Add Employees to Existing Rotations. You might need to say, well, starting tomorrow or Monday, and for the rest of the year or for however long out we have our schedule built, that employee that just got promoted their schedule is going to change from Squad A to Squad B. Again, I can adjust their start and end times. Maybe my supervisors have, my sergeants have hours that are slightly different from the rest of the patrol shift. I could adjust that here. I could assign them to a permanent job if they have one. And then I would hit Apply up at the top. And that will update that employee schedule to reflect their new rotation. Okay, and finally, once you've applied that, going back to the employee zone, the administration menu, and again, only if your department is using replacement policy, do I have to come down to overtime control or replacement policy, and maybe I need to update the employee list. If your department has separate lists for officers and sergeants, well, maybe you have to take me off the officer list. Right? Modify employee, uncheck that person, select and close, and save that. And then maybe I have to go in and add them to the sergeant list. Select our list, modify employee, choose the person's name, and hit select and close. I have to give them a sort order, so we want to put them at the end, so we'll make them 8. And hit save. If your department just uses one big list with everybody on it and uses the rules to kind of filter who shows up when we need to call someone, then you may not need to move people from one list to another because you're just using one list. That's only if you have like a separate officers list and a separate sergeants list. But in addition to the list, you probably have to go in under Administration and Employee Center and go to Overtime Selection Skill Set and choose that employee and say, okay, we'll click on David and we'll see his skill is patrol. Maybe we want to remove that by using delete and then change it to be sergeant. Okay, that's if you're using these overtime selection skill sets to filter the results of your replacement policy. Again, those items are only if your department is using replacement policy. Okay? So to recap, for our to promote our employee to a new title, we want to go under Administration and Employee Center, update their employee profile, such as title, seniority group, maybe their validation skill set and overtime groups. You may have to update their pay info with possibly a new work group. and maybe new pay rates. You have to update their user profile with new security to make sure they can do what they have to do as a supervisor. And then you will probably have to go under Build Schedule and add employees to existing rotations to update that person's rotation to reflect their new schedule. The final steps, and only if your department uses replacement policy, would be possibly adjusting the employee list that that employee is part of, and also updating the overtime selection skill sets. Okay, does anybody have any questions about those items for promoting an employee to a new title? Okay. The last thing we're going to cover today, and actually our shortest topic, is going to be terminating an employee. So after an employee has been with your department and they are now going to be leaving, we can go in and we can terminate an employee. To do that, we're going to go under the Administration menu. And the first thing we'll do is go under Employee Center and Employee Profile. We'll find our employee and click on them. Now, some people, their first thought is to go to Employee is Active and just uncheck that box. But that doesn't remove the employee from the schedule. It just makes them inactive on your lists and leaves their schedule the way that it was. So what we're going to do to kill two birds with one stone, we're going to use the button at the very top here that says Terminate Employee. And that's going to both make the employee inactive, and it's also going to remove them from the schedule for us. So when we hit Terminate Employee, we get a pop-up. It's got our employee's name here, and we would choose our termination date. That's the date that we're going to remove them from the schedule as of. And then we'll choose a termination type. We have a few options here. And then there's a spot in there for termination reason. I can either just rewrite what was up here in termination type, or maybe I can put some notes in there if there was a certain reason that this person was terminated or something along those lines. And then I'll hit Apply. And we'll get this pop-up asking, are we sure we want to terminate this employee? And the reminder that this will permanently delete all schedule entries for this employee as of the effective date of termination. So again, we're going to delete their schedule entries from that termination date going forward. And if we're sure, we're going to go ahead and click Yes. Successfully terminated employee. Now that doesn't delete the employee. The employee is still in our system. They're just in a not active category. So you'll see right there, he's shown as not active. We don't want to delete the employee because we want to make sure that you can always access their records. We don't want to have you not able to access those any longer. Anytime that I go to run reports or things like that, when I go to select my employees, we always default to the active employees only, but you could always choose non-active employees if you want to run a report for someone who's no longer with your department. So something comes up and I need to run and see how much time off an employee took last year who's no longer with the department, or how much overtime they worked. You can still run those reports for those employees that are not active. It's just that by default, we don't show them in your list. So your lists aren't clogged up with employees that are no longer active in your department. Another benefit of making them inactive and not deleting them is if the employee ever came back, I can go back to my employee profiles. I can go to my not active employees and choose the person here. And I have an option to reactivate the employee. So maybe they retire and come back in another position, or maybe they leave the department and then end up coming back for whatever reason. I can just go into my inactive employees, choose them, and hit reactivate employee. And just go ahead and apply this. Are you sure you want to reactivate this employee? Yes. Successfully reactivated. And now they start to show up in our active list again. And I could just go in, take that employee, maybe make some adjustments. Maybe they're coming back now as a different title or in a different group. But I can make those adjustments, save them. I can put them back on the schedule. Without having to re-enter all of their information again, I can just reactivate their employee profile. Okay, so that's the main step for terminating an employee. Second step, which is optional, but some departments do choose to do, is again under Administration and Employee Center. We can go to the User Profile screen. We can find their user profile, and we can delete it. That, again, will help to make sure that you don't have extra user profiles in here cluttering up your list that you no longer need. And also make sure they no longer have access to the system. So I click on their name, I hit delete. And that will remove that from our user profile list. Okay, so those are really the two main steps for terminating an employee. Going to the employee profile and clicking Terminate Employee at the top, and also deleting their user profile. Does anybody have any questions on those two steps to terminate an employee? Okay, I don't see anything coming through. So that's our last topic for today's lesson. Are there any questions on anything that we covered today? Entering a new employee, promoting an employee, or terminating an employee? Okay. I don't see that's coming through, so we'll go ahead and conclude our session today. Thank you all for attending. I just want to remind you to feel free to sign up for additional trainings, our other basic training sessions, our advanced training sessions, which cover topics like replacement policy and other rules you can set up and so on. Those can be signed up for the same link that you signed up for this class. You can also sign up for help out sessions if you need any additional help or one-on-one time with a VCS trainer, whether it be just a couple of questions you have or a specific topic you need to cover, or maybe you need help setting up specific rules for your departments. Those help outs are designed for that. If you sign up for a help out, just please be prepared to let us know what topics you're looking to discuss when you sign up. And those help out sessions, they don't have a preset topic, so we're counting on you to let us know what you want to discuss in that help out so we can help you with whatever questions you have. Okay? Thanks again for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and conclude our recording and end our session. Have a great day, everyone.